Let me just make sure my, let's see, I want to share my screen here and get the technology set up here. Well, thank you for that overly flattering introduction. There's not much selflessness involved. This is the stuff that makes me get up in the morning, and it's always a pleasure to be able to share. It's the rest of the stuff that I have to do during the day to support my habit that requires a little sacrifice of some sort. Okay, well, yes. Boy, there are so many themes that are of interest and of value to my mind, at least, in our circumstances in today, in today's world. We will be touching on many of those all too briefly, I fear, but hopefully we can present an overview of where we're at in the Great Controversy. That's really what I want to do. And as we get to the end, we try to get more practical, more specific, because we are here. We are in 2021. We are in our respective geographic locations. We now are standing on the battlefield, and there are some specific things we can learn from that setting and that process. And so that's, I want to be practical. Okay, so let's just jump in. We're going to start kind of at the beginning, because that's just what makes sense. And in order to understand where we're at now, we've really got to understand how we got here. Let's see if I can make this work now. Okay. What's needed now? Well, God calls for far more tact, more wise generalship than has yet been given him by his human agents. There is need of sharp, sanctified thinking and keen work to counteract the ingenious plans of Satan. I put that slide in there because one thing that has distressed me more than most anything else in my time of teaching is seeing Adventist young people who somehow have been, conditioned to think that their role is to basically sit idly by waiting for the second coming. And nothing could be further from the truth. God is calling for tact, generalship, sanctified thinking, keen work. We are involved. We need to recognize that and jump at that chance. The Lord will not write as wise those who cannot distinguish between a tree that bears thornberries and a tree that bears olives. Well, I'm sorry, I really don't even know what a thornberry is precisely, and I've had no experience with olives, so I reduced it to the standard metaphor, at least where I grew up. Can we tell the difference between apples and oranges? We need to at least figure out that much when we're looking at God's work. And okay, so that's all I'm going to say on that. We have a chance. We have a responsibility. Let's jump into it. So we're going to start at the beginning, as I said. Now, if I said in the beginning, you would probably think of this verse, and that's actually the third of our beginnings. If I pressed you to think about those words a bit more, eventually, I'm sure you would probably come up with this verse in the beginning, and that's the first one. That's time immemorial, right? And number 3 is when the earth was created, but we're actually going to be looking at the one in between. Jesus, speaking to a group of his countrymen once upon a time, said, "You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, for he is a liar and the father of it." So this in the beginning, that's what we're looking at right here. Lucifer was a murderer and a liar from the beginning. Now, not everyone saw that. In fact, very few saw that. we have here a verse that you are no doubt familiar with, a passage from 2 Thessalonians. The mystery of lawless is already at work. Coming, the lawless one is according to the working of Satan with all power, signs, and lying wonders, with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this reason, God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Now, this is the New King James translation. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the traditional King James. And if so, you might have caught a very subtle, very slight difference in the wording. And that would show up right here. In the New King James, it just says a lie. And I can't resist. I used to be an English teacher, among other topics. And so I have to point out the difference. These are the articles, a, an, and the, right? These are parts of speech, well, specific usage of speech. And there's a difference. If I looked out my window and saw a road there and I said, a car just went past, that wouldn't mean too much because, cars go past on roads quite commonly. But if I said the car just went past, that somehow, due to context, would mean more to you. It was a specific car, not just any car. It was a specific car. And so this here, and I confess I'm not a Greek scholar at all, but my friends who are tell me that in the Greek, this is a definite lie. This is not just any lie. This is a definite lie. And so I suspect that lie would be a very fundamental issue, a very basic type of thing. And so I'm going to suggest that we can find that in Isaiah chapter 14. You're all familiar with this verse as well. I will ascend in heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. And I want to focus specifically on this portion here. Lucifer made all these claims. I will ascend. I will exalt. I will do this. I will do that. I will be somebody really great. And in effect, he said, and when I do that, I will be like the Most High. Because that's what God did. I'm speaking on Lucifer's behalf here, not my own, thank you. God exalted himself. God set his throne above all the others. God chose where he would sit and how he would be. And playing devil's advocate, it's perhaps not, well, we know so much more than the angels knew at that time. And so I could imagine Lucifer, and I'm sure he was much more subtle than I will be here, but I could imagine Lucifer saying, I've been wondering about things. And it just occurred to me that when we all go to Jerusalem for worship, we always worship God. Why do we always worship God? I mean, there are a lot of other really amazing people, but we always worship God. And I'm the choir director, and we've got a lot of hymns, millions of hymns. I don't know how many hymns they have, but we've got many, many hymns, but they're all about God. I'm just wondering why that would be. Why is everything about God? Do you suppose it's because he just set it up that way? Do you suppose maybe God is selfish? I mean, after all, he owns everything in the universe. Well, angels had never heard thoughts like that before. Lucifer's just saying, I want to do what God does. I want to be like the Most High. How can you fault me for wanting to be godlike? Satan boldly contended that in struggling to carry out his purposes and have his own way, he was only imitating the example of God. If God followed his own will perfectly and continually, why should not the first sons created in his image do so? That's a little different way of looking at this. I will be like the Most High claim than I had entertained. He says, I just want to follow my own will. God does. Well, before we go any further, I need to establish one quick boundary. And that is that there is no way we can explain the origin of sin. It is impossible to explain the origin of sin so as to give a reason for its existence. Sin is an intruder for whose presence no reason can be given. It is mysterious, unaccountable. To excuse it is to defend it. Could excuse for it be found or cause be shown for its existence, it would cease to be sin. There is certainly not, within my knowledge, any cause to be shown for the existence of sin. People might debate as to whether God understands the cause for sin. I will let them debate that. That's beyond my understanding, and I am quite positive that if I go down that path, I will create philosophical difficulties for myself that I will be unable to solve. It is impossible to explain the origin of sin. If we can't explain the origin, the next question might be, does it make any sense to even study sin, to try to understand sin? In educational circles, we might say, is this an elective course? Do I really have to study this? And God has given us some counsel in that regard. The evils which have existed in all ages will continue to exist till the close of probation. We need to understand the cause of these evils and the modes of Satan's attacks that we may be able to resist them. And here again, I go back to my opening comments. We are not called to sit idly by and let the great controversy develop around us. We are called to understand and to resist. There is nothing we should dread so much as being ignorant of Satan's devices. Those who do not realize their danger because they do not watch will pay with the loss of their souls the penalty of their presumption and their willful ignorance of Satan's devices. That sounds serious. And that yet, like so many issues in the Christian life, there is a balance. We can easily get all caught up trying to pursue all the reports of evil and all the concerns, we would call it a conspiracy theory. There are so many conspiracies. Why would there be so many? Well, because the devil's not stupid. The moment he realizes that we might be trying to understand his work, of course he's going to create counterfeits and deceptions and decoys and all sorts of things. It's maybe some would remember, I don't know if it's of any use anymore, I don't know, but back in like World War II or something, when they were using radar to spot airplanes, right? They had what they called chaff, which was just lots of little strips of tinfoil or something of that nature, and they'd blow that out the back of the airplane to confuse the radar. The devil's going to do that. Of course he's going to do that. And so there is a balance. There are things we need to understand. We have to have a level of comprehension of Satan's devices, and yet, we don't need to go overboard. We need not feel compelled to work out the solution of every problem that we cannot understand in order to meet Satan's wiles. Nor am I to keep my mind reined up to thwart Satan's devices. Why? Because God is supreme. He is our stronghold in time of trouble and perplexity. If we put our entire trust in him, we shall find that he is an all-sufficient guide. That balance is not something that I can tell you how to strike. That balance is something that God will have to guide you individually on. Okay, well, moving on. Why would Satan hate us? I think this is important to understand. He does. He hates us. Very specifically, collectively, and individually, he hates us. He wants to kill us. That's the level of, what would I say, intensity of the conflict of the great controversy. Why would he hate us? Here, I think we can understand some things. Let's take a moment and understand our foe. The greatest talents and the highest gifts that could be bestowed on a created being were given to Lucifer, the covering cherub. Before his fall, he was a glorious being, occupying a position next to Christ. Okay, now I want to point something out here. God is the one who gave Lucifer his talents and gifts. Could God have given Lucifer greater talents or higher gifts, according to the statement? Could God do that? And just according to the straight English meaning of the words we're looking at, the answer is no. The greatest talents, the highest gifts that could be bestowed on a created being were given to Lucifer. Okay, just note that. Lucifer was a covering cherub, distinguished by his excellence. God made him good and beautiful, as near as possible like himself. And so now I have to ask another question. Could God have made Lucifer more like himself than he did? And according to that statement, the answer would be no. Well, still, why would Lucifer hate us? Let's see, I just want to click, there we go, okay. Lucifer chose to sin. We will never be able to explain that. What we do know is that the history of the origin of sin happened in fairly close relationship to the creation of earth. When God said to his son, "Let us make man in our image," Satan was jealous of Jesus. He wished to be consulted concerning the formation of man, and because he was not, he was filled with envy, jealousy, and hatred. Now, the very beginning of sin, was it over our creation? I don't think so. I may be wrong, but my guess would be that no, Lucifer had somehow begun to harbor selfish thoughts already, and then the creation of earth came up. I don't know that. There are many things beyond my knowledge, but that would be my guess. Let's see, another statement here. Satan hates mankind because they are the workmanship of God. He opposed the creation of man. Now, this is interesting. Everything is the workmanship of God. And yet somehow this implies that Satan hates mankind in a special way. It says he opposed the creation of man. Well, in normal English usage, that would mean before it happened. This is not objected to the creation of man. That would be after it happened. This would, most likely after anyhow. But normally when we say he opposed, that's Lucifer saying, don't do that. That's a bad idea. Why would he say that? Why would he hate us, right? And so my question is, the relationship between the beginning of sin in Lucifer's mind and heart and the creation of earth, are they close together? I think they're very much connected, actually. Let's consider these statements now from Lucifer's point of view. after he had secretly begun to cherish selfishness and pride. Next to the angelic beings, the human family, formed in the image of God, are the noblest of his created works. Okay, that's a simple idea. The earth was to be peopled with beings only a little lower than the angels. Okay, that's simple too. That's just like Psalm chapter 8 and Hebrews chapter 2. Man was created a little lower than the angels. That's what Paul said. And that's what David, probably, Psalm 8, David, I suppose, said. Now, look at this one. No other creature that God has made is capable of such improvement, such refinement, such nobility as man. Man cannot conceive what he may be and what he may become. Through the grace of Christ, he is capable of constant mental progress. Well, wow, that statement makes human beings sound pretty special. And I want you to notice words like improvement, become, and progress. You remember Lucifer's greatest gift was the highest talents and greatest gifts. They were given, fully formed at creation. That wasn't the case with human beings. This is an ongoing process. To improve something means it's changing and getting better, right? It was a wonderful thing for God to create man to make mind. God created man that every faculty might be the faculty of the divine mind. Now, I'm just going to have to tell you, I don't know what that means. That's beyond my understanding. It does sound very special, however. Man was the crowning act of the creation of God, made in the image of God, and designed to be a counterpart of God. Man is very dear to God because he was formed in his own image. Okay, that's interesting. Weren't the angels formed in the image of God? Maybe not in the same way, maybe not in the same degree. Counterpart, fascinating word to try to describe the relationship between man and God. Doesn't mean equals, really, but counterpart. Very interesting, very interesting. Let's go on. A couple more statements here. God would place man upon probation to test his loyalty before he could be rendered eternally secure. If human beings endured the test wherewith God saw fit to prove him, he should eventually be equal with the angels. We haven't seen that idea before. Equal. This is something that would happen eventually. That's a progress, a process of time. But there are more statements. And those who in the strength of Christ overcome the great enemy of God and man will occupy a position in the heavenly courts above angels who have never fallen. Above angels. What happened to a little lower than? The work of redemption involved consequences of which it is difficult for man to have any conception. There was to be imparted an excellency of power which would place him higher than the angels who had not fallen. Now, notice these last two statements, these higher than statements, right? They described the end result of the plan of salvation after redemption, right? Lucifer wouldn't have known anything about that. So we have to ask whether this above the angels result was something that would only happen because of sin and salvation, or was it part of the original plan for human beings? Do we end up better off because of our experience with sin, in other words? Well, we need to know a little bit more about Lucifer before we answer that. God was a light so effulgent that Lucifer occupied the position of covering cherub, so that the universe could at all times look upon his glory. Now, that word there on the first line, effulgent, that is not a common word these days. I don't know if it was ever a common word in her day, but Ellen White chose to use that. And fortunately, it has a simple meaning. It just means really, really bright. Okay. God was a light so bright that Lucifer occupied the position of covering cherub, so that the universe could at all times look upon his glory. Lucifer was responsible for covering this effulgency of God, right? That was his job. Well, one of his jobs, right? It was, like I said, also the choir director and who knows whatever else. But it was that job that was his highest profile job. That was why he was known as the covering cherub, right? He was to cover the glory of God. He who was once the covering cherub, whose work it was to hide from the heavenly intelligences the glory of God, perverted his intellect and divorced himself from God. Okay. Now notice his job here. This was his function in the heavenly courts, right? To hide from the other angels the glory of God. He could see it, they could not. That's a pretty special position, right? But what was going to happen to Lucifer's job if this idea ever caught on, right? Adam and Eve were granted communion with their maker with no obscuring veil between. Before sin, of course, no obscuring veil between. This is a position that was a change, let's put it that way. What would happen to Lucifer's job as the covering cherub when human beings came along? Okay. Through the imparted life of Christ, man has been given opportunity to win back again the lost gift of life and to stand in his original position before God, a partaker of the divine nature. So that's the answer to our question. Or do we end up better off because of sin? No, we don't end up better off. We end up in exactly the place God designed us to be, the original position. Satan, in his efforts to deceive and tempt our race, had thought to frustrate the divine plan in man's creation. Now remember, that divine plan was a process that would lead them to be higher than the angels. Maybe you can see why he would hate us. Now, he shouldn't have. The proper response would have been, praise the Lord. This will be a new experience for me. I've never had anyone but God himself above me. And now I get to find out what it's like to have a supervisor. This will be a blessing. And it would have been. It should have been. But Lucifer had cherished selfishness by this time, and he chose not to see it that way. Satan, in his efforts to deceive and tempt our race, had sought to frustrate the divine plan of man's creation. But Christ now, at the end of the great controversy here, but Christ now asks that this plan be carried into effect as if man had never fallen. He asks for his people not only pardon and justification, full and complete, but a share in his glory and a seat upon his throne. Remember, Lucifer had a thing about where his throne is going to sit? But Jesus says repeatedly, to him that overcometh, he will sit with me on my throne, even as I overcame and him sat down with my Father on his throne. Okay. Let's go on. So maybe all of that is why this next statement is true. The creation of our world was brought into the councils of heaven. There, the covering cherub prepared his request that he should be made prince to govern the world then in prospect. We would say probably then in the planning stages. This was not accorded to him. Jesus Christ was to rule the earthly kingdom. Under God, he engaged to take the world with all its probabilities. I think that would include the probability of sin as well, by the way. The law of heaven should be the standard law for this new world, for human intelligences. Lucifer was jealous of Christ, and this jealousy worked into rebellion, and he carried with him a large number of the holy angels. Okay. Well, all that gives us some background, and maybe that's why he hates us. Maybe that's why we are involved in this special sense in the great controversy. You know, no one else in all of creation is in the same position as we are in this great controversy. I think that background's important, but that's all just background. Next, we want to look at what it is that is at the very heart of sin. Now, this is a fine line. I'm not trying to describe the origin of sin because that's beyond my understanding. But once we understand that Lucifer cherished selfishness, and it's not that hard to see why sin would develop the way it did. So let's look at the very core, not the origin, but the very core of Lucifer's rebellion. There is one very simple but immensely important issue. Once upon a time, God said, Lucifer, please do this thing, whatever it was. Now, God had said that many times, but once upon a time, for the very first time, Lucifer thought, no, I don't want to do this. I want to do that because that is better. He hadn't always been rebellious. So clearly there was a first time. I have no idea what that looked like or what it was about, or I just don't know any of the details. Wouldn't it be crazy if it all started over a minor issue? Wouldn't it be just so ridiculous if the very first time Lucifer differed with God, maybe God said, oh, for worship tonight, let's open with hymn number 55,677,812. And Lucifer said, well, I was really thinking of a different hymn. Thank you. Wouldn't that be crazy? And you know what? It might have been something very small, because certainly for human beings, not eating of one tree when they had everything they could possibly desire from all the other trees and bushes and shrubs and plants, that's a very small thing. But I don't know. Let's go on. Now, in order to get to this point where Lucifer says, no, what God wants is not best, I have a better idea, one of two things had to have already happened. Either Lucifer believed that God had made a mistake, and it might have been this way. It might have been Lucifer, oh, I can't believe it. God's always been really smart in the past, but somehow he just goofed this time and he came up with a bad idea. Maybe. There's another option, though. If it wasn't that, then he believed that God had deliberately commanded something that was not in Lucifer's best interest. It's one thing if God makes a mistake. It's another thing if he's doing it intentionally. In other words, Lucifer had lost faith in God, and that is huge. That is the central issue of sin. If God had just made a simple mistake, well, that was a serious concern. After all, God was in charge of running the universe. You can't have God making mistakes. Who could trust his wisdom if it had been proven faulty? And if God hadn't made a mistake, then it meant that he was intentionally harming his subjects. Who could trust his love if it had been proven false. So Lucifer had lost faith in God's wisdom, certainly, and probably his love as well. It's possible that it was just wisdom at first. God, and Lucifer might have said, well, God made a simple mistake here. Well, okay. But God said, no, I didn't make a mistake. And so at that point, quickly, Lucifer would have said, well, then you don't really understand what you're doing, and you don't love your created beings. Okay. This is actually a very simple, very profound issue. And I say simple on good grounds. Faith, this is Ellen White now, faith is a very simple matter. I kind of get tired about efforts to see faith as being complicated. It's not complicated. It's a very simple matter. And she completes her sentence by saying, it is confidence in God. That's all it is. Are you confident in God? Do you trust him? Do you believe him? What is it to be in an unsaved condition? Is it not to be living without that full confidence in God, which is born of love, which leads us to take him at his word? That's what it means to be unsaved if I don't trust God. Faith is a very simple matter. I've got confidence in God. If I lose that confidence, I've lost faith and I've lost my salvation. This is why the Bible talks about righteousness by faith and justification by faith and salvation by faith. This is why you have Hebrews 11, the faith chapter. Faith in God is the central issue of everything. Some have faith, some don't. The moment you don't have faith in God, it starts a chain reaction. If Lucifer believed he was smart enough to spot God's mistake, that meant Lucifer was smarter than God, right? God made a mistake and I caught it. I'm pretty smart. What's more, if God had tried to trick Lucifer, if God had done this intentionally, tried to trick Lucifer into doing something that wasn't for his best good, then the mere fact that God had failed to fool him meant that Lucifer was smarter than God. That's the stuff pride is made of. Now, once Lucifer concluded that he was smarter than God, it would be easy for him to simply do what he was sure was the best thing. After all, he was the smartest person on the block. He knew what was good. He knew what was smart. Why listen to God? And that's what we call disobedience. The loss of faith precedes the act of disobedience. We can see the act. God sees the condition of faith. But that's not all. There's more. Even if Lucifer never said a word about his disobedience, the influence of his actions told all the other angels, you can't depend on God to take care of you. You need to take charge of your own life. You need to do what God does. You need to exalt yourself, right? That's where he started. I will exalt myself and I will be like God. That's a lie. It's based on the lie that God is selfish. That's what I think is the lie, that God is selfish. That's the fundamental lie of everything Lucifer's ever done. But saying you need to do what God does and exalt yourself, that's also a lie. That's a very fundamental lie too, but not perhaps the lie. But that's not all. Once Lucifer took the responsibility of caring for himself, it meant he had to do whatever it took to provide for himself. Notice that? I can't trust God's wisdom. I can't trust his love. I'm going to have to take care of myself. If necessary, that meant stealing. If necessary, that meant murder. If you have what I need, I have to take it. I have to have it. I need it. I have to take care of myself. So I will steal what you have. And if you try to stop me, nothing personal. It's not that I don't like you, but I have to have it. And if I have to, I will kill you. It's interesting. One way that I've summed this up, the contrast between Christ and Satan, is that Satan says, I know what I want. And if I have to, I will kill you in order to get it, because I can't trust God or anyone else to take care of me. And on the other side, we have Christ. And he says, I know what's best for you. And if I have to, I will die so that you have a chance to obtain it. I don't want to die, but my Father thinks it's best, and I trust his wisdom and love, so I will do that. That's a stark difference between those two characters. And those two, Christ and Satan, they are real people, so to speak. Not in any sense of human, but they are real individuals. They know each other very well. And this is a controversy between Christ and his angels and Satan and his angels. This is a very personal engagement. Like Jesus said, Lucifer was a murderer from the beginning. From the very beginning, the inception of his loss of faith, the moment he said, I can't trust God to take care of me, that included the idea of murder. And it's interesting, it didn't happen right away. In fact, there was a complete war in heaven and nobody died. So it took a while. But from the very beginning, in his heart, Lucifer was a murderer. If I don't believe God will take care of me, that's a loss of faith. If I think I can do a better job taking care of myself than God can, that's pride and stupidity. If I try taking care of myself in some way other than what God asked me to, that's the act of disobedience. If my influence convinces someone else that self-serving is better than service, that's lying. And if I put myself first instead of loving my neighbor as myself, that's stealing, and under enough pressure, it will become murder. This all happens unavoidably to those who do not have faith in God. That's the core of rebellion. Saying, I cannot trust God. He's not smart enough, or he doesn't love me. Okay, hold that thought. Now we need to go on just a bit more, and to understand our current position, we've got to look at the way Lucifer promotes his ideas. He came along with this brand new idea, this brand new crazy idea of sin, loss of faith in God. How did he ever convince a third of the angels? Well, we don't have time to cover all the statements that fill in these details. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just put up a list of specific tactics that Lucifer used, and then we'll give a little bit of supporting evidence from the spirit prophecy. There's a good reason for us to be aware of these techniques. It's not because God is going to ask us to use them, but other people may try to get us to use these techniques, or they may try to use them against us. Either way, our safety is to understand them to some degree, but refuse to have anything to do with them in practice. So here's what Lucifer did. He exploited his position and trust as long as possible. Of course, he was the highest of the angels. Of course, they trusted him. He hid his intentions from others. He wouldn't tell them what he was really thinking. He would imply or insinuate without clear assertions. He would distort others' perceptions up to and including hypnosis, Ellen White says. He would maintain plausible deniability. Some people may not be familiar with that term. The idea there is if I'm the highest authority and I want something done that happens to be illegal, well, it's very unseemly for me to go out and do this illegal thing. It's also very, it's not good for me to give an order for someone, lower down the chain of command to do this illegal thing. And so, sadly, what happens too often is that the authority who wants the illegal thing done quietly somehow gets the word down the chain of command that says, the boss really wants this illegal thing done, but he can't tell you to do it. Would somebody please step up to the plate and do this for us? But you're all on your own. And that's the denial, the plausible deniability, right? I didn't do, I know nothing about this. Oh, what a terrible thing. They did something illegal. I had nothing to do with it. That's plausible deniability. Okay. He would shift responsibility to others and blame them for anything that came up or went wrong. He would, of course, lie. He would abandon discredited positions without accepting responsibility for having advocated them. He'd say, let's do this. And then it would become obvious that this was a bad idea. Well, he never said, oh, I'm so sorry. I had a bad idea. No, he'd never say that. He would just simply drop the topic, never mention it again, and move on to some other claim or argument. He would cite supporters as evidence of correctness. Oh, look, they all agree with me, so I must be right. And then lastly, he would appeal to sympathy. Why is God always picking on me? God's just always picking on me. Okay, going to have a few quick slides here that will give some support for these things and some illustration of how these tactics, these approaches worked out. Satan began to stir up rebellion using underhand methods, winning a few at a time to his side. There followed that which had never before been seen in heaven. Satan began to place his thoughts in the minds of angels. When he supposed that his suggestions and misrepresentations of God were entertained, he presented those whom he had deceived as originating these suggestions. He presented suggestions as something that must be investigated. He easily gathered large numbers to listen to his specious devisings, and thus, without compromising himself, succeeded in causing the minds of many to become disaffected. The unsuspecting were ensnared and taken. And this is so sad. And I mean, really, were any of the angels suspecting? And they'd never heard anyone lie before. They had no experience with this kind of thing. Wow. But you can see several of the things here. He would plant suggestions without really being forthright and saying, this is what I really think, right? He would misrepresent. He blamed it on others. He said, this is his idea, right? Okay, so you see some of those things. Words have power to react on the character. Men, and I think angels, are influenced by their own words. Often under a momentary impulse, prompted by Satan, they give utterance to jealousy or evil surmising, expressing that which they do not really believe. But the expression reacts on the thoughts. They are deceived by their own words, and they come to believe that truth, which was spoken at Satan's instigation. It is dangerous to utter a word of doubt, dangerous to question and criticize divine light. Something about hearing an idea come out of my own mouth makes my brain think that I believe it. This is one of the reasons Ellen White was opposed to debate societies, right? Because you will end up being assigned a position that you don't believe. And if you get good at arguing that which you don't really believe, you end up believing it to some degree. And so that's what Lucifer did. Ellen White mentions this technique perhaps more than any other, I would say definitely more than any other, in discussing how Lucifer deceived the angels, that he would plant a thought in their minds and come back later and bring the discussion right up to that point and say, well, what do you think? And they would repeat the thought that he had planted and then come to believe that it was their own idea. Going on. Many of these angels who sympathized with Lucifer had occupied high positions in the government of God. All were enriched with the talent of intellect and were girded with strength and glory. This is an interesting parallel to Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, right? Who persuaded 250 of the princes of the assembly, right, to join their rebellion. Lucifer was jealous of Christ, and this jealousy worked into rebellion. He carried with him a large number of holy angels. Jesus, the Son of God, was not deceived by Lucifer's sophistry. He stood true to principle and resisted every line of reasoning of Lucifer and all the angels who had taken sides with him, thus evidencing that as he stood, every angel might have stood. This is a fascinating quotation. I'm not sure that I fully understand it, but it makes me think that in some special way, Jesus was showing angels how to live. It's almost like the incarnation, where he came to show men how to live. That's interesting. I can't tell you too much more about it. That's about the only statement that I can point to that says that. Well, eventually, where God had to settle things or straighten things out. The great creator assembled the heavenly host that he might, in the presence of all the angels, confer special honor upon his son. The Son was seated on the throne with the Father, and the heavenly throng of holy angels was gathered around them. The Father then made known that it was ordained by himself that Christ, his Son, should be equal with himself, so that wherever was the presence of his Son, it was as his own presence. The word of the Son was to be obeyed as readily as the word of the Father. Especially was his Son to work in union with himself in the anticipated creation of the earth. Now, this to me is a related thought to the last one. It appears, at least from the perspective of the angels, that Jesus was promoted, so to speak, okay? That he had held a position here, and now he was elevated in his position. That's not the case, of course, that the relationship between the Father and the Son has been the same for all time. I think that statement here. Maybe I should put that in. I think that's a statement that would help some people in the discussion of the Trinity, which in some circles is getting agitated, which I think is unwise, but that's okay. Jesus and the Father were always in exactly the same relationship that they have been, but to the angels now it appeared that he was being elevated, and God was explaining that he was equal with himself. And perhaps they saw that as a new development, when in fact it was simply a statement as to the existing reality. Going on. I do have that statement. Okay. Christ is declared in the scriptures to be the Son of God. From all eternity, he has sustained this relation to Jehovah. And so that's why I say it appears that this announcement, so to speak, was something that was perhaps not fully understood by the angels as having existed from all eternity. But anyhow, okay, let's go on. I say and have ever said that I will not engage in controversy with anyone in regard to the nature and personality of God. Let those who try to describe God know that on such a subject, silence is eloquence. Let the scriptures be read in simple faith, and let each one form his conceptions of God from his inspired word. And I guess I put that in, I'd forgotten that, but I put that into as commentary on those who are agitating the question of the Trinity. I think it's unwise. Personally, it was important that we understand God, and so Jesus came to display the character of his Father, which we'll see more in our next talk. It was important that we understand Jesus and that we remember all that he taught us, and so the Holy Spirit was given to bring all those things to remembrance and to lead us into all truth. I've never yet found that there is a inspired indication that it's important that we understand the nature of the Holy Spirit. No one's been given that job, and I certainly don't want to take it up myself. Let's go on. Satan exultingly pointed to his sympathizers, comprising nearly 1/2 of all the angels, and exclaimed, "These are with me. Will you expel these also and make such a void in heaven?" And this is where he's citing all his followers, as everybody agrees with me. Well, no, it really wasn't everyone. It was nearly 1/3. Will you make such a void in heaven? And I think I'm certain that Lucifer thought the answer was going to be, oh, wow, that's a lot of angels. No, we can't do that. And he was probably caught totally by surprise that the answer was, yes, it's exactly what's going to happen. When it was announced that with all his sympathizers, he must be expelled from the abodes of bliss, Satan and his hosts threw the blame of the rebellion wholly upon Christ, declaring that if they had not been reproved, they would never have rebelled. That's craziness. They were reproved because they rebelled, not the other way around. Lucifer cast the cause of his defection upon Jesus Christ and upon God. If they had not so firmly resisted his plans, he said he would not have gone on doing as he did. And again, that's craziness. Of course, he would have gone on doing exactly what he did. He kept doing what he did even when it was resisted. So why would he have stopped before? That's the appeal to sympathy. Okay. These tactics, I mean, we can list them. We cannot fully comprehend them. It is impossible for man to measure the ingenuity shown by Satan in deceiving human minds. You are no match for Satan. Don't try it. Don't entertain the concept at all. Here's one more statement to give you an idea of how badly outmatched you are. Lucifer's work of deception was done in so great secrecy that the angels in less exalted positions supposed that he was the ruler of heaven. I cannot explain that. I don't know how that worked. I don't know. I'm just telling you, he's more of a match than you want to take on. Okay. The originator of sin worked with all his deceptive powers, and the Lord permitted this rebellion to develop before anything was done to save the angelic host from apostasy. I'm just going to mention that the first time I read that statement, it really seemed offensive to me. It seemed like God was at fault, that he should have done something to save the angelic host from apostasy. We'll talk about that and explain that in our meeting tomorrow. Last slide. We have to know what we're arguing about. If I say the car is blue and you say the car is red, we could stand there and slap each other in the face back and forth all day long over our argument. Or we could walk out and look at the car. You have to know what the argument's over. And so these are the accusations that Lucifer brought against God and his government. I came up with a very simple idea. This was 20 years ago now. I said, I want to know what we're arguing about. And so I put together this huge search, the Spirit Prophecy, that had everything I could think of about Lucifer or covering cherub or great apostate or any of those names for Lucifer, everything about God and heaven and the law and the commandments and the Decalogue, and accusation or complaint or anything like it. And I came up with 100 and I don't know, what was it, 46 or 7,000 paragraphs in the Spirit Prophecy. It took me a year to read through them. And when I started, I really thought that I was going to find dozens and dozens of accusations. Well, there are many different ways that they are worded, but really they come down to a fairly simple list. Angels are holy by nature. These are, and this is in the chronological order that Ellen White presented these. Okay, angels are holy by nature and enough to govern themselves, so they don't need God's law. Lucifer just said, God, thank you very much, but we're really smart and we're really holy, so we're good. We don't need your law. Well, apparently, very early on was the occasion when Jesus was exalted, if you wish. Actually, his true position was revealed. And Lucifer said, that's unfair. That's a bad decision. That's just not right. It's kind of like he still thought of himself, still thought of Jesus as just another angel. It's like, maybe, well, Jesus has some good points and I've got some good points, but overall, I think I should get the job. He said, it's unfair. It's a bad decision. Well, God denied that. And then so Lucifer becomes more personal. He says, well, God, you're selfish. And God denied that. He says, God, you're unforgiving and revengeful. And God denied that. He said, God, your law is defective and it needs to be changed. Your whole government needs to be overthrown. And God said, no, the law is perfect and it cannot be changed. It cannot be changed. That's an important distinction. In Ellen White's portrayal, she never has God say, I won't change the law. He always says it cannot be changed. Number 6, accusation, neither angels nor human beings can obey God's law. Of course, human beings hadn't been created yet at the time he first started saying this, but he said, nobody can keep that law. That's how I know that it's defective. It's impossible to keep it. And you can just hear the other angels saying, Lucifer, is like, we've been keeping that law forever. And he says, oh, you're just not so smart, are you? Trust me. I'm the covering cherub. I know these things better than you. You can't really keep that law. Well, God said, no, the law is perfect. It's not going to change. It cannot be changed, and everyone can keep it. And Lucifer came back with a new argument. He said, God, that's obviously not true. Your law is arbitrary. And what that means, simply put, is it is what it is because you said so. You said, this is the speed limit. You can't drive any faster than this. God's law is arbitrary. And God said, no, it's not. And then Lucifer came back with what he probably thought was his wisest and greatest attack against God. He said, well, God, if you claim that your law cannot be changed, that means you cannot forgive anyone. If you're not in charge of the law, it isn't what it is because you set it up that way, which incidentally, almost everything we think of as a law is, right? Speed limits and how much you get taxed and, all those laws are because somebody somewhere, parliament or somebody, I don't know, city council or the mayor or whatever it is, but somebody said, well, this is the speed limit, or this is how much we're going to tax you, or this is, what you have to do here, or what you have to do there. Those laws are arbitrary. And Lucifer said, God, you say your law isn't arbitrary. It isn't what it is because you said it is. And if that's the case, then you can't forgive anyone. And of course, God said, Lucifer, you just don't understand. The law is not arbitrary. And of course I can forgive. Well, Lucifer then said what he had to say. God, you're just lying. You're just lying. So these are the accusations, and this is where we end here. These are the accusations that started the great controversy. And so my question for you, my assignment, if you will, is put yourself in God's place. Now, what are you going to do? How are you going to respond to those accusations? So that's where we're going to leave it for today.